In the spring of 1942, the German 11th Army stood on the high ground above Sevastopol and watched a Soviet army die with its back to the water. The defenders had nowhere left to run. They were pinned on a narrow spit of rock at the western tip of the Crimea, a place called Cape Khersones, and the sea behind them offered no escape. German guns walked across the beaches. German bombers circled overhead. The men waiting for ships that would never come scanned an empty horizon until the shells found them. 2 years later, almost to the day, the same beach filled up again, the same trapped columns, the same desperate eyes on the same empty sea. But this time, the men dying on Cape Khersones wore German uniforms, and the planes screaming down out of the sun above them carried red stars on their wings. This is the story of how the Soviet Air Force turned the Crimea into a killing ground, and of the fast little dive bomber that did the killing. The plane the crews called the Peshka, the pawn. How does a pawn end up checkmating an entire army? To understand that, you have to understand where this aircraft came from, and it did not come from a clean drawing office with sunlight and pride. It came from a prison. The man at the center of it was named Vladimir Petlyakov. Before the war, before the prison, he was one of the finest aircraft engineers the Soviet Union had. He was born in 1891, came up through his technical studies after the revolution, and went to work in the design group of Andrei Tupolev, the most famous aircraft designer in the country. Petlyakov was not some junior draftsman. He was a man who built big things. His big thing was a heavy bomber called the TB-7, a 4-engine giant meant to fly high and far and carry tons of bombs deep into enemy territory. Petlyakov's team did the real work of turning that idea into metal, and the prototype lifted off for the first time in December of 1936. That aircraft would later be renamed in his honor. It became the PE-8, and it was one of the only true 4-engine heavy bombers the Soviets ever fielded in the whole war. By any measure, the man who designed it should have been celebrated. Instead, the state came for him. In 1937, at the height of Stalin's Great Purge, Vladimir Petlyakov was arrested. The charge was sabotage. It was nonsense. The kind of nonsense that got thousands of men shot in the back of the head in those years. A famous designer was an easy target, and the secret police were not in the habit of letting facts get in the way. But Petlyakov was too valuable to waste against a wall, so instead of killing him, the state put him to work. They sent him to a place called TSKB-29, a sharashka, a special prison run by the secret police, where captured engineers designed weapons under guard. Petlyakov and his team worked behind locked doors. They watched the world through barred windows. Men who should have been free, building the planes their country needed, were now prisoners of the very government they were serving. And there, in that locked design bureau, they began to draw a new aircraft. It started as something else entirely. The first design was a high-altitude fighter, the one the engineers called the VI-100. The idea was a fast, modern interceptor that could climb up into the thin, cold air and hunt enemy bombers where nothing else could reach them. It had a pressurized cabin so the crew could breathe at altitude, sleek twin engines, and clean modern lines. For 1938, it was years ahead of its time. The prisoners had built something genuinely brilliant. But the war that was coming would not be fought in the high, thin air. It would be fought low, in the mud and the smoke, right on top of the men dying below. Nobody needed a high-altitude interceptor. They needed something that could come down and break the enemy on the ground. So the order came down to change it. Turn the fighter into a dive bomber. Strip out the pressurized cabin and the high-altitude gear. Add dive brakes to control the plunge. Cut a glass nose into the front for a bombardier. Build it for a crew of 3 and hang bombs under its wings. And the men who gave that order, the Soviet Air Force Command, were not patient people. Petlyakov's team was given 45 days to do it. 45 days to redesign an aircraft from the ground up, while living as prisoners under guard, knowing exactly what failure would mean for men in their position. The team did it anyway. What rolled out of that prison bureau was the Pe-2, and it would become the most produced twin-engine combat aircraft the Soviet Union ever built. More than 11,000 of them came off the lines before the war was over. Here is what made it special. Most bombers of that era were slow, fat targets that lumbered over a city and dumped their load from high up, hitting whatever happened to be underneath. The Peshka did not do that. The Peshka came down. It could reach a top speed of around 336 miles per hour, which was faster than a lot of the fighters sent up to stop it in the early years. It carried a crew of 3, a pilot up front, a navigator and bombardier crouched in the glass nose, watching the targets swell up in front of him, and a gunner and radio operator in the back, twisting around to keep enemy fighters off their tail. When the Peshka attacked, it rolled over and dropped into a screaming dive, engines howling, the whole airframe shaking, the target rushing up to meet it. The crew rode that dive down, lower and lower, until the navigator released the bombs from the racks under the wings at the last possible second. Then the pilot hauled back on the controls, and the plane clawed its way out of the dive, sometimes pulling so hard the men nearly blacked out. That kind of attack put the bombs exactly where they needed to go. A column of trucks on a road, a ship tied up at a dock, a gun position dug into a hillside. Things a high-level bomber could never hit, the Peshka could plant a bomb right on top of. A typical dive bombing load was around 1,300 pounds of explosives, delivered with a precision that nothing else in the Soviet arsenal could match. By 1944, the men flying these planes had turned that precision into a science. They flew in tight groups of 6 to 9 aircraft. They alternated between diving attacks and level attacks to throw off the German gunners on the ground. And they had learned to shuttle, landing at forward strips close to the front, rearming and flying again, sometimes 4 or 5 strikes in a single day before the sun went down. This was not how things had started. In the first year of the war, the Soviet Air Force had been gutted. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the opening days, and the crews who survived were thrown into the air half-trained against German pilots who had been fighting and winning for years. The early Peshka crews paid for that in blood. They learned to dive while men beside them were being shot out of the sky. They learned to read the ground, to time the pull-out, to cover each other in the turn, one hard lesson at a time. Every trick they used in 1944 had been bought with the lives of men who flew in 1941 and 42 and did not come home. So when the Crimea opened up in front of them, these were not green pilots stumbling into combat. They were veterans. They knew exactly what a dive bomber could do to a road full of trucks, because they had spent 3 years figuring it out the hard way. All of that skill, all of that hard-won experience, was about to be aimed at one place, a peninsula in the Black Sea where an entire German army had been left to rot. Because while the Peshka had been growing up, the war had turned. And the same Crimea that had been a German trophy in 1942 was about to become a German tomb. Let me take you back to how the trap closed. And to do that, we have to start with the first time the Crimea was a killing ground, when it was the Soviets dying on those beaches. In September of 1941, the German 11th Army, commanded by Erich von Manstein, smashed its way into the Crimea. They broke through the Perekop Isthmus, the narrow neck of land that is the only way onto the peninsula by road, and then they fanned out and overran almost the entire Crimea. Almost. One place held out. The great fortress port of Sevastopol on the southwestern coast refused to fall. What followed was one of the longest, most brutal sieges of the entire war. Manstein ringed the city and battered it for months. He brought up some of the largest artillery pieces ever built, monstrous guns that hurled shells the size of small cars into the Soviet defences. The defenders held on through the winter and into the spring, taking everything the 11th Army could throw at them. The Soviets tried to break the siege. In the winter of 1941 going into 42, the Red Army landed troops on the Kerch Peninsula, on the far eastern side of the Crimea, hoping to force Manstein to turn around and fight them instead. For a while it worked, and it pulled German strength away from Sevastopol. But the Germans counterattacked in May of 1942 and destroyed the Kerch bridgehead, and with the eastern threat gone, Manstein could turn his full weight back onto the fortress. The final assault, the one the Germans called Operation Sturmfang, opened with a massive bombardment and then a ground attack launched on the 7th of June 1942. The defenders fought for every yard, but they were running out of ammunition, out of food, out of room. By early July, it was over. And here is the part that matters for everything that comes later. When Sevastopol finally collapsed in the first days of July, the senior Soviet commanders were lifted out by submarine and by aircraft. The men in the ranks were not. Tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers were left behind, abandoned, with no way off the peninsula. They were pushed back to the only ground left, the western tip, a low finger of rock called Cape Khersones. There they waited for ships that never came in anything like the numbers they needed, and the Germans closed in and took them or killed them. The promise of rescue had failed, and a Soviet army had died with the sea at its back. Picture what those last days looked like. The cliffs and the narrow beach packed with men who had nothing left. The water in front of them and the enemy behind. Some of them stood in the surf and stared out at the horizon, willing a rescue fleet to appear. And nothing came. The Germans on the high ground watched it happen, and let it happen. For the Soviet Union, Cape Khersones in 1942 was a wound, a place where its own soldiers had been left to be ground down because there were not enough ships and not enough time. The men who survived it, and the men who heard about it, did not forget the name. Remember that beach. Remember Cape Khersones. Because in 2 years, the men standing on it would be wearing different uniforms. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad and the collapse that followed, the German position in the south of the Soviet Union came apart. The Red Army was no longer the army that had been thrown back in 1941. It had learned, it had grown, and now it was driving west. By the autumn of 1943, the Soviets had swept across the Ukraine in a vast tide, liberating city after city, and the German forces holding the Crimea suddenly found the ground behind them gone. In November of 1943, the Red Army reached the approaches to the Crimea and cut the peninsula off by land. The land bridge to the rest of the front was severed. The 17th Army, the German formation responsible for the Crimea, along with its Romanian allies, was now an island. Hundreds of thousands of men, sitting on a piece of ground they could no longer reach by road, supplied only by what could be flown or shipped across the water. The smart move was obvious, and the generals on the spot knew it. Pull them out. Evacuate the Crimea while there was still time, while the sea lanes were open, and use those soldiers to plug the holes in the crumbling front somewhere they could actually fight. The German commander in the Crimea, General Jaenicke, drew up plans for exactly that. A naval evacuation to get the 17th Army off the peninsula before the trap snapped shut. Manstein himself argued the Crimea should be given up. The order from the top said no. The Crimea would be held, the argument went, because giving it up would frighten Romania and uncover the oil and the coast beyond. So the request to evacuate was refused. The 17th Army would stay. And so, 250,000 men were left sitting in a trap, waiting for the hammer to fall, held in place by a decision made hundreds of miles away, by men who would not be standing on those beaches when the end came. It fell on the 8th of April, 1944. That morning, the soldiers of the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front, commanded by General Fyodor Tolbukhin, launched their assault across the Perekop Isthmus, the same narrow neck of land Manstein had stormed 3 years before. This was the front door, and they came through it hard. At the same time, on the far side of the peninsula, the separate coastal army pushed in from the Kerch direction, squeezing the Germans from the east. And above all of it, the Peshkas went to work. This is where the dive bomber earned its reputation. As the 17th Army began to give ground, its only choice was to fall back towards Sevastopol, the same great fortress port on the southwestern coast. That meant moving men, guns, trucks and horses along a handful of roads, out in the open, across a flat peninsula with almost nowhere to hide. For a force of dive bombers, that is a dream, and the Soviet airmen treated it like one. The Peshkas came down on the retreating columns again and again. A road packed with vehicles is the most fragile thing in war. Knock out the first truck and the last truck, and everything in between is frozen, jammed nose to tail, unable to move forward or back. Then you simply work down the line at your leisure. The dive bombers did exactly that, rolling in, releasing, pulling out, climbing away, and coming back around for another pass. The retreat towards Sevastopol turned into a gauntlet. Every mile of road became a place where the sky could open up and kill you. Kerch was reached on the 11th of April. Simferopol, the city in the heart of the peninsula, fell 2 days later. In barely a week, the great defensive plan had collapsed, and the 17th Army was streaming back toward the coast, with the Red Army close behind and the Peshkas overhead. By the middle of April, what was left of the German and Romanian forces had pulled back into the Sevastopol fortress zone. And here is the bitter irony that the men on the ground may not have had time to appreciate. They were now standing exactly where the Soviet defenders had stood 2 years before. The same hills, the same harbour, the same trap. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the air war over the Crimea, take a second to subscribe. We tell the stories of the Eastern Front the way the men who fought it would recognize, and there is a lot more coming. While the 17th Army crammed itself into the fortress zone, the noose kept tightening, and the men inside had to defend ground they had never prepared for an attack from this side. The Germans had taken this city in 1942, but it had cost them dearly. Sevastopol is built for defense, ringed by high ground, its approaches studded with positions that command the roads in. When the Germans held it, those defenses faced outward against the Soviets. Now, those same heights had to be stormed by the Red Army, and the 17th Army had to defend a city it had spent almost no time fortifying for an attack from this direction. Worse, the men inside were exhausted, beaten, and short of everything. They had lost guns and vehicles on the retreat. They had been bombed and strafed every mile of the way. And now they were pinned against the water with a confident, well-supplied enemy closing in. The final assault on Sevastopol opened in early May. Soviet artillery hammered the German positions, Soviet infantry pushed up the slopes, and the Peshkas were there for all of it, diving on strongpoints, smashing gun positions, breaking up any attempt to form a new defensive line. The key was the Sapun Heights, the ridge that dominates the eastern approach to the city. Whoever held that ground held Sevastopol. The Red Army stormed it, and the air support overhead helped pry the defenders loose, position by position. Once the heights fell, the city was finished. Sevastopol fell on the 9th of May 1944. 2 years earlier, almost to the day on the calendar of that long war, it had been the Soviets surrendering this ground. Now, the Soviet flag went back up over the ruins. But the fall of the city was not the end of the killing. In some ways, it was the beginning of the worst of it. Because when Sevastopol fell, The survivors of the 17th Army did exactly what the Soviet defenders had done in 1942. They ran for the only patch of ground left. They ran for Cape Khersones. And here the mirror becomes almost perfect and almost unbearable. Cape Khersones is a low, narrow finger of rock jutting out into the Black Sea at the very western tip of the Crimea. There is no harbour there worth the name, no proper docks, no jetties, nothing but beaches and cliffs and open water. It is the last place on the peninsula, the place where the land simply runs out. It is the exact same ground where the abandoned Soviet defenders had waited to die 2 years before. Roughly 40,000 men of the 17th Army were driven onto that headland in the second week of May. Behind them came the Red Army, tightening the noose. In front of them was the sea, and the only hope of survival was a ship. The Germans had been promising evacuation, and ships did come. Transports steamed out from the Romanian ports across the Black Sea to lift the trapped men off the beaches. But this is where the full weight of Soviet air power came crashing down. The same Peshkas that had hunted the columns on the roads now had a far richer target. A transport ship, low and slow, packed to the rails with thousands of soldiers, is the most vulnerable thing imaginable to a dive bomber. The Soviet airmen knew it, and they came for the ships. For the men on the beaches, it was a nightmare without an exit. They waited in the open, under a sky that belonged entirely to the enemy. Soviet bombers worked the beaches and the boats. Soviet shore guns ranged in on the loading points. Men who fought their way onto a ship were not safe, because the ship still had to cross open water under that same hostile sky. On the 10th of May, the day after Sevastopol fell, 2 large transports loaded with evacuating troops put to sea. Their names were the Totila and the Teja. Both were caught and sunk. The loss of those 2 ships alone is counted at up to 10,000 men, drowned or killed in the water in a single day. Think about that. 10,000 men on 2 ships in one day. The sea around Cape Khersones filled with wreckage and bodies. The promise of rescue turned into a death sentence because every ship that came to save them became a target the moment it appeared. The last phase of the evacuation, in the days from the 10th to the 14th of May, was the fiercest of all. The fighting on the headland was savage and close. The men still ashore were squeezed into a shrinking pocket, fighting and dying with the water at their backs, watching for ships in an inferno of fire and noise. Some got off. Many did not. When it was finally over, the numbers told the story of a catastrophe. Across the whole collapse, the German and Romanian formations lost something on the order of 57,000 men. A huge share of them drowned in the evacuation that was supposed to save them. The 17th Army, the force entrusted with holding the Crimea, had been smashed and scattered into the sea. The peninsula that had been a German fortress was, in a little over a month, swept completely clean. So, what does the Peshka have to do with all of this? It would be a lie to say one type of aircraft won the Crimea by itself. The infantry climbed the heights. The artillery broke the lines. The tanks drove the breakthroughs. But the dive bombers shaped the whole battle in a way nothing else could. They made the roads deadly, so the retreat became a slaughter. They smashed strongpoints, so the assaults went faster and cost fewer Soviet lives. And at the very end, over the beaches and the boats of Cape Khersones, they turned the only escape route into a graveyard. An army trapped against the sea cannot survive if it cannot use the sea, and the Peshka made sure it could not. There is something fitting about it if you step back. This aircraft was born in a prison, designed by a man the state had locked up and very nearly thrown away. Vladimir Petlyakov drew the bones of it from behind barred windows, with no idea whether he would ever walk free. Its whole story began in humiliation and fear, and yet it grew into one of the sharpest instruments the Soviet Union ever fielded, flown by crews who had spent 3 brutal years learning their trade the hard way against an enemy that had once owned the sky. By 1944, those crews had taken everything the early disasters had taught them and turned it into mastery. The pawn had been promoted, and on the cliffs and beaches of the Crimea, it helped erase an entire German army from the map. 2 years earlier, the Germans had stood on the heights and watched a trapped Soviet army die at Cape Khersones. They had refused to pull their own men out when they had the chance, and they must have thought the Crimea was theirs for good. The wheel came all the way around. The same beach, the same sea, the same hopeless wait for ships that came too few and too late. Only this time, the red stars were the ones in the sky, and the 17th Army was the one with the water at its back. If you want to see how the Soviet airmen learned those lessons the hard way, in the desperate years before the tide turned, watch the video on screen next. And subscribe before you go, so you do not miss the next story from the Eastern Front.